I've always loved solo hiking. There's something about being alone in the mountains, miles away from anyone, that clears my mind in a way nothing else can. This time, I had picked a spot in the Rockies, remote enough to feel like I was truly out there, but still within a day's hike of the nearest trailhead. It was late September, and the air was crisp, but not yet cold enough to be uncomfortable. By the time the sun started to set, I had found a good spot to camp. It was a small clearing just off the trail, surrounded by trees with a view of the mountains in the distance. I set up my tent, built a little fire, and settled in for the night. The silence was soothing. No cars, no chatter, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees and the crackle of the fire. After eating dinner, I felt the familiar wave of tiredness from a day of hiking. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and laid there for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. Slowly, I drifted off. I don't know what woke me up. Maybe it was a distant animal call or the shifting of the wind. But as I lay there, still half asleep, I heard something that made my heart jump, a sound that was unmistakably human. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching over the leaves outside my tent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen another person all day, and it was well past midnight now. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere at this hour? The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could see the shadow of a figure through the thin fabric of the tent wall. My heart was pounding in my chest, loud enough that I was sure whoever was out there could hear it too. Then, in a low, calm voice, the person spoke. "Hey, do you know where the trail leads from here?" I didn't know how to respond. My mind was racing. Who was this? Why were they here? And why were they so calm? Something about the way they spoke, so casual, like they weren't standing outside a stranger's tent in the dead of night, sent a chill down my spine. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to stammer out a response. Yeah, the trail goes down toward the river. But it's pretty late, you know?" There was a pause. Then the voice responded, still unnervingly calm. "Thanks." The figure didn't move for a long moment. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Then, just as quietly as they had come, they turned and walked away, their footsteps fading into the darkness. I lay there wide awake, for the rest of the night, every rustle of the wind making me jump. I never heard them return, but I didn't sleep again. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my camp as fast as I could and headed back toward the trailhead. I still think about that night sometimes. Who was that person? What were they doing out there? And why did they ask for directions in the middle of the night, like it was the most normal thing in the world? I'll never know, but that calm voice and the shadow outside my tent still haunt me. I had come to the cabin to be alone. The mountains had always been my escape when life got too loud, and as a writer, I often found that solitude was what I needed to get the words out. This place was perfect, tucked far away in the hills, surrounded by trees with nothing but the sound of wind and the occasional bird. No distractions, no noise, just me, my thoughts, and the work. When I arrived, the manager at the small lodge gave me the key to my cabin. There was a man standing nearby, a groundskeeper, I assumed. He was older, thin, with rough, tan skin and small eyes that seemed to gleam. He was smiling, too wide, almost like he was trying to show every tooth. It felt off, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I just wanted to get settled in and start writing. The cabin was simple, cozy enough, with a big window that looked out over the trees. I sat there for hours, trying to write, but I couldn't focus. Something felt strange, like I wasn't as alone as I had thought. I chalked it up to nerves. It was probably just the remoteness of the place getting to me. Then, on my second evening, as I stepped outside to stretch my legs, I saw him again, the groundskeeper. He was standing off to the side, near the edge of the woods, not doing anything, just watching. His hands were in his pockets, and that same grin stretched across his face. When I noticed him, I froze for a second. He didn't wave, didn't call out, just stood there with that unsettling smile. I nodded politely, forcing a small wave, hoping he would go back to whatever he was supposed to be doing. But he didn't. He just stood there, eyes fixed on me, like he was waiting for something. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and quickly retreated back inside the cabin. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even inside, I felt exposed, like his eyes were still on me, peering through the windows. When I lay in bed, every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside made me jump. I barely slept. The next morning, I went for a walk to clear my head. The fresh air helped, but when I returned to the cabin, he was there again. This time, he was closer, standing just across from my door. The grin was still there, but his eyes didn't match the smile. They looked cold, dark. "Morning," he said, his voice calm, too calm. It almost sounded like he was mocking me. I nodded, trying to hide my discomfort. "Morning." He didn't move, didn't stop staring. My skin prickled with unease, and I quickly went inside, locking the door behind me. I stayed inside the rest of the day, trying to write, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see him standing there, waiting. By the third day, I was done. I couldn't take the feeling of being watched, the way he would just appear out of nowhere. I packed up early, wanting nothing more than to leave and get back to civilization. As I made my way back to the lodge, I saw him one last time. He was standing by the path, that grin still plastered across his face. "Heading out?" he asked, his voice low and almost amused. "Yeah," I replied, not looking at him. "Thanks for everything." He didn't respond. I hurried past him, my heart racing until I was safely inside my car, pulling away from the cabin and that unsettling grin for good. Even now, when I think back on it, I can still see him standing there, watching, his smile fixed as though he knew something I didn't. The fog clung to the trees that morning, so thick it seemed to absorb sound. My partner, Hannah, and I were hiking through a narrow trail just outside of Olympia, our boots crunching softly over the damp pine needles. The forest was shrouded in a gray mist, and while it made everything feel eerie, I found it oddly peaceful too. It felt like we were walking through some hidden, forgotten world. We hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. It was early, and the only sounds were our own footsteps and the occasional caw of a distant crow. I remember thinking that it was strange. On weekends like this, the trail was usually busy with other hikers. But we were alone, surrounded by nothing but towering Douglas firs and the ghostly fog weaving through them. It was calming in a way, until the sound of laughter echoed faintly from somewhere behind us. At first, I thought I imagined it. I stopped, turning to Hannah. "Did you hear that?" She nodded, frowning. "Yeah, weird, right?" It sounded like laughing. We waited for a few moments, listening, but the laughter didn't return. We shrugged it off, assuming it was other hikers somewhere further down the trail. We kept moving, but the silence that followed left me feeling unsettled. Every so often, I'd glance back over my shoulder, expecting to see someone emerge from the fog, but the trail behind us remained empty. Then we heard it again, louder this time. Laughter, but not close enough to make out any distinct voices. Just a vague sound, like a group of people having fun. I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. "Maybe we should turn back," I suggested. Hannah shook her head. "No way. Let's just see where it's coming from." We pressed on, the laughter seeming to grow closer, yet still distant enough to feel unnerving. The fog made it hard to tell where the sound was coming from. It seemed to shift, sometimes to our left, sometimes right behind us. After what felt like an hour of this strange game of cat and mouse, we rounded a bend in the trail and stopped dead in our tracks. There, tucked into a small clearing, was an abandoned campsite. But something was off. The tent was collapsed, as if it had been hastily packed or blown over. But a small fire still crackled in the ring of stones. A pot hung over the flames, and the smell of cooking food filled the air. Fresh food, still warm. I walked closer and crouched beside the fire, my eyes scanning the ground. No sign of people. No bags. No sounds but the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional drip of moisture from the trees above. "This is creepy," Hannah whispered, stepping closer to me. We stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The laughter had stopped, and the forest felt disturbingly quiet. We didn't stay long. The fog, the emptiness, the lingering warmth of the fire, it all felt wrong. We turned and left, walking faster than before. the unease now sitting heavy in my chest. The laughter didn't follow us this time. It was as if we had stumbled into something we weren't supposed to see, something that had vanished as quickly as it appeared. We never did figure out where the laughter came from, or who had been at that campsite. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there.